Everything in my being cringes at the section of this book where the tragedy and what is named the great sadness begins. Even in the preview, it is hard to watch, read, and experience. The story of Missy's disappearance and death feeds into my own deepest fears and nightmares. Children are not supposed to die, and parents are always supposed to die before their children. The death of a child, a teenager, or a young adult has been my greatest fear long before I had my own children. And I am sure that many of you in this room know a bit of that struggle and that fear. And this book and the movie do not hold back. Both of them force you to go there in heart-wrenching ways. But it is the same heart-wrenching reality that we need to be reminded of as we go to the cross. I think it is helpful to remind us of the enormity, again and again, of what it means for Jesus to die and what it means for us today when there are still people all throughout our world who are dying that should not be dying yet. Death, darkness, and great sadness is what the season of Lent actually calls us to do. Because the season of Lent is about going there. It is about the places of great sadness and finding ways through those great moments of sadness to truly be resurrected into a new way of being. Lent forces us every year to question the importance of life, death, and life beyond death. And sometimes because we know the biblical story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, we emotionally really do not find ourselves going there. Because sometimes and so often it feels like it's just too much. But sometimes life, or even a book, can remind us that people are in situations, even in our pews, where they have no choice. They have to go there. Their painful realities are a part of their everyday lives. They do not just watch sad news stories that can be turned off and then ignored. And so for us, I ask you this Lenten season to go there. There's a story of the Native American princess that is told toward the beginning of the book. It is it's a real legend shared of how the Multnomah Falls came to be in Oregon. Mac's daughter's Missy, who is 6½, goes on to ask some pretty big questions about the story of the Native American princess who had to willingly die to save her people from a great illness. This is what Missy says. Well, the Great Spirit makes the princess jump off the cliff and makes Jesus die on a cross. That seems pretty mean to me. Mac discovers that Missy is afraid she will be asked by God to jump off the cliff. That at some point she feels she may have to be sacrificed. And Mac tells her, as a good parent does, that that is not true. But is it? As we come to this book, we have to start asking those difficult questions. Why did Missy have to die? Why did the princess have to die? Why did Jesus have to die? Why do other prophetic voices seem to have to die? Why does death seem to be the only way for people to be saved? Isn't that mean? And then we have this story in today's scripture, a story where God and Jesus were able to bring back to life the teenage girl who was dying. Why this girl? It all of a sudden seems to kind of break the rules of how we understand God. Why do some people seem to get miracles and others do not? or the big questions of life, or what Lent calls us to do. Why do good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people? Why does Matt get to meet God? Is his pain really that much worse than so many other people's pain in this world? And then there's that cliche response. In that moment where somebody looks and says, well, everything happens for a reason. I find that statement to be deflating for the person who has lost something so great. That reason is just not part of the experience at that moment. You see, Mac and Jairus both have moments in their stories where they are responding because it is not reasonable. A child dying in any situation is not reasonable. The responses are not reasonable. In fact, Jairus choosing to seek out Jesus was a deep act of desperation, not reason. Jairus represents one of the leaders in the synagogue, a group that often does not appreciate the stir that continuously keeps being caused by Jesus. So for him to go to Jesus is a really strange move. It is a desperate move. I heard this guy might be able to help, and even though I don't really believe it, it's my daughter. I'm desperate. Mac in the shack gets a note from God. And in an act of desperation goes to a place he hates the most out of a sense of desperation. So do we only seek out the holy when we are desperate? Do we only seek out the holy when God does not seem to respond in the way we expect? And then when all of a sudden God doesn't respond in the way we expect, we bail. And we decide that it is time to blame that mean old God. It's interesting, if something tragic were to happen in our country tomorrow, this church would be filled next Sunday. Filled with people who are desperate for answers to a hurt that they cannot understand. They would be seeking an experience that is tangible in a way that does not often happen in the normal way that God works. They would want to find a shack. They would want to find daughters who are raised from the dead. They would want to find it, and they would want to find it now. And I can tell you that a few weeks later, this church would not be as full. Because when they did not find it now, when they did not find it on their own terms, they would do what many have done in this time and walk away from the church and God. They made statements like Mac makes in the book. I'm done, God. I can't do this anymore. I'm tired of trying to find you in all of this. Tired. Done, desperate, and beyond reason. Have you been there? Maybe you are one of the lucky few who has not been there. But maybe you are like many who sit in a pew each week waiting. Waiting for God to show up. And doing what Matt does until God does show up. Judging God. In both the shack and the story of Jairus, it is interesting to note that the miracles do not immediately happen. Matt's daughter had been killed 3.5 years earlier. And there is a whole different biblical story that happens as Jairus is forced to wait. He's probably annoyed and frustrated. He just has to wait through a whole nother story for Jesus to finally decide whether or not to heal and help his daughter. So what is with all this waiting? I mean, people are struggling with a deep sense of loss and fear and pain. There are children and prophets dying, and yet here we always feel like we are still waiting. drive a person into a crazy sense of desperation. And yet, maybe a little crazy is what we all need to really be open to understand how life, real life, can come from death. Maybe it is through waiting that we recognize that we have to give up control. Maybe it is through the waiting that we empty ourselves so much that God can finally enter in. While reason is a part of our faith that is important, at times we still must remember it's faith, not fact, but faith. And faith opens up a door that does not limit the little bit of crazy that may be needed sometimes to truly know God and trust God and really depend on God. Let's be honest, waiting stinks. It can drive all of us crazy, especially when our lives feel like they have spiraled out of control with grief and elevated fear because we have no choice but to live in this pain and great sadness. And the only choice we have left is this weird act of desperation to go there. And when it is time to go there, you have to be a little bit crazy, just a little, to be willing to go in faith. And it doesn't have to be a lot, but just enough for the crazy to be the only reasonable option that seems left. God is all that is left to lift us up. And it's okay in those moments to be afraid. Mac in the book had to be afraid. It's why he brought a gun as he headed back to the shack. Jairus was risking his entire image of life, his job, and his lifelong understanding of God by seeking out this rebel named Jesus. And yet, they're not so afraid to try, and so they all of a sudden go and enter in. Faith is all that is left for both of these men who have a deep love for their daughters. As I've read both of these stories, I do not believe that God picks one child to live and the other to die. That would be the mean God that Missy wondered about. For me and my understanding and my study, God is all love. But what stands in our way to know that love is always the question. Our lives, our reputations, like Jairus, often stand in our way. Our inabilities to be patient. Our need as humans to blame and judge. Our human ability to focus on all that is bad and hurtful over finding the real good that could possibly be present. Something can happen when we are desperate enough to open a door to a shack or move a rock away from a tomb to know life beyond the pain, the lies, and the facades that so often limit us. And that means we have to go there. And while we often go there and feel alone, maybe there's a moment where we recognize that we aren't alone, that within our deepest fears and nightmares, the face of evil that cuts off our wings and grounds us is not where God is, but God is trying in that deep fear to find ways to reconnect and come back to us. You see, I do not think that faith eliminates the fears of the worst scenarios, but faith is the desperate plea to find illumination in the midst of our greatest fears. Illumination, real illumination, can only come from God. And always seeking and trusting that relationship with God. Even trusting in what seems unreasonable. and knowing that God is there to love us. But that means sometimes we must wait. Sometimes we must go there. And sometimes we won't understand. God is not about that. God is about life. And life for us, again and again, comes as Christians from knowing a Jesus who brought us the understanding of life beyond death. And we go this. And we go there not to seek answers for death, but we go there to illuminate life in the darkness. We have 5 more weeks of Lent. We are going to the shadows. We are going to the cross. Are you coming with us? God is.